Welcome back to Golioth. Today we're talking about Zephyr support in the Golioth Firmware SDK. I'm here with Mike, and he's going to tell us all about it and some of the new changes coming in the beta version of the SDK.
Yeah, so I think the first thing we should talk about is we already had top level Zephyr support. Like, it's not new that we have Zephyr support. So there's still a Golioth Zephyr SDK. It still exists. But what we're talking about with beta is we have a second SDK that covers multiple platforms, and we're adding Zephyr as one of the platforms to that. So the Golioth Firmware SDK has Zephyr support now in beta. It will be in beta for the rest of this year, which is only like a couple more months, and we're planning to move towards general availability next year. And today I kind of wanted to go and walk through it and talk about how people can give feedback before it does kind of get set in stone.
Great. Yeah, I think we should start with why are we doing this? Why even smush them all together?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Well, first of all, we have had a lot of development go on both platforms, and they don't have the same APIs. So the APIs are different. So if you're using an ESP-IDF part on the Golioth Firmware SDK, and then you want to use a different part and decide you want to use Zephyr, you need to figure out what the different API calls are in the Zephyr SDK. So in that case, if you have devices from different platforms, if you choose to use the firmware platform for everything, you're going to have the same APIs. Also, we don't want to have a situation where we add a new feature and we roll that feature out and announce it, and it's only in one SDK to start with. We want everyone to have all of the top tier tested features available to them all at the same time. And I know this is, Chris, one of your favorite topics is when Golioth throws out a feature, you get both sides. So you get well-tested, stable cloud platform side, and you get well-tested, stable device SDK side.
That's right. Yeah, I always talk about, like, some people decide to build the entire IoT platform themselves. Maybe Golioth isn't a good fit for them. Maybe they're just a huge company. But in those cases, I think you have to have a team that kind of goes in lockstep. You have to be, or you're usually not in lockstep, rather. Usually, the firmware team says, we want this new feature. We want something like remote procedure calls. And they say, okay, we're going to write the device SDK. And then they talk to the cloud team, and the cloud team puts it on their schedule, and that moves forward, and it's testing back and forth, back and forth. And oftentimes, then things are kind of out of sync. Every time Golioth rolls out a new feature, you get access to that new feature immediately, both on the cloud and on the device side, because all of the device stuff is tested. And not only that, it's tested against all of the hardware that we support, like continuously verified boards that are both in Zephyr and in the cross-platform SDK.
Yeah, and so that test regimen continues. Like, we're testing in both SDKs, but as Zephyr's been added to the firmware, we're adding those same tests to all of that continuous integration. So if you are interested in more information about like what the beta is about, go check our blog, because there was a blog post about it a few weeks ago. I have it up on my screen here. It's great. Got a lot of information and answer any questions that you might have. You can always reach out to the developer relations team as well. But I think what we should do today is more talk about like what the experience is to use Zephyr on the firmware SDK. First and foremost, we have documents for this. So if you go to docs.golioth.io, there's a firmware tab up here, and then you'll see here are the two SDKs, the Zephyr SDK, which still remains, but the Golioth Firmware SDK, which has the Zephyr support added to it. And this will cover, all of like the API calls and what you're doing and examples of these applications and basically all the support that you need. But for me, I generally will go to GitHub and look at what stuff is all about. And so this is the firmware SDK. This is not the firmware SDK. I will find the firmware SDK here.
While you're doing that, I think it's interesting too. So like as a hardware firmware developer, I'd say a firmware light developer, the concept of APIs always felt like a web kind of centric thing, but it really is. It's basically the calls that you'll make within a program to then call something at a lower level, right? That's really what an API is, right? Application programming interface.
Yeah.
And those exist in the device level as well. You'll probably hear that in two contexts with Golioth, because we also have cloud side APIs, but Mike's talking here about the device side APIs, and it's really important to understand that unified experience is really going to be, if you learn the Golioth device firmware APIs, you will have the same experience whether you're on an Espresso part, a Nordic part, an XP part, all of these different things with the new firmware SDK.
Yeah, and the SDKs are open source. So if you want to go and look under the hood and see how we're doing things, you can totally
Yeah.
dig through all the code. It's
Yeah.
right there for you, but you don't
Cool.
have to. You can just, I need to send some data up to
I
Goliath.
shall
It's a
not.
one API
I,
call. Yeah, exactly.
I'm a very high level kind of person. Mike, if you could just write me example code like the template you were showing there too, I'll just use that. I'll just plug in my data, and I'm great.
Oh, well, I have a little template demo for this video. We'll get to that in a
Awesome.
sec. So
Perfect.
I'm now
Perfect.
on the right repo, the Goliath
Okay.
Firmware SDK repo, and it talks about the platforms that are currently supported. So we have Espresso's ESP IDF that's based on FreeRTOS. We have Infineon's Modus Toolbox, the Zephyr SDK, which also covers Nordic's flavor of Zephyr called NRF Connect SDK or NCS. That's in beta. And then we do have Linux support, but this is not for production. We use this for internal testing. You can play around with it if you want, but we suggest you stick to the device SDKs for your actual production devices. And it tells you where to go and find the documentation, which is for each one of these, which is under examples, and then the name of the port, which is Zephyr here. And we'll go in and you can see that things are very similar with Zephyr in the firmware SDK in that we use the West meta tool to actually pull this in. And that's instead of a git clone. And that's because it sets it up in the place that it should be, which is as a module for
Mm.
Zephyr. So you would run this command, you'd run your West update, and it pulls everything in that you need. If you are installing like Goliath first and then Zephyr and everything else later, you will need to run this command, which includes a git submodule update. If you're just adding this to an existing application, which is this stuff right here, existing West application, you won't need to do that because it uses submodules. So you can just add this to your West YAML and type West update, and Goliath will then be available to all of the programs that you're using in that installation.
If I may, can I contextualize this a little bit more? I feel like I talked
Yeah,
about APIs a
sure.
little bit, but because we're building on top of all these other real-time operating systems and all of the vendor code and all that other stuff, if I make a call, which we're gonna go over the APIs here in a second, but I was just thinking about like all of the stuff that it does under the hood. Then too, it handles all like the networking stuff, the transport layer, the security. Basically, at this point, as a hardware developer trying to do more firmware, I basically get to make a call on a device and then I get access to the internet. That's kind of how I think about it because and all of that stuff, so you and I do a lot of like cellular device, NRF 9160, whatever. I make a call on the device, all that stuff up through the cell tower, over to the cloud, everything else you see, it's just like done. I know
Yeah,
it's, people won't be
right.
like,
And
well, I might have to interact with some of it, but that piece, that's like the magic piece to me.
yeah, and a lot of the like guardrails for you to make sure, like, okay, I'm going to try and send this to Goliath. Do you actually have a socket available for it? And if not, the SDK, if you're calling an asynchronous call, the SDK will like cache that and wait till it does. And you like cache
Right.
could fill up eventually, but for the
Yeah.
most part, like you can go about your business and continue taking readings or doing whatever else that you want. And in the
Yeah.
background on another thread, Goliath is going to handle that actual upload or download or whatever you're trying to do with the transfer.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too is that like as a hardware engineer coming into this world, I kind of always thought that's how it worked. And then it's like, no, 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 you got to go set up a socket yourself, Chris. You got to go
Yeah.
and do this stuff in FreeRTOS or in Zephyr, whatever. Like and now, or you have to go on the cloud side and do the configuration. And now
Yeah, and
it's
nobody should have to
much better.
build their own network stack. So
That's
this
right.
is good.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Also, in this area, so in the example Zephyr, you would expect to see examples, and these examples that you saw in the Zephyr SDK, if you've used that with Goliath before, are still there. So, like, hello is the basic can I get connected? LightDB is stateful database. Set, get, observe, delete. Streaming data is great for your sending time series data from your sensors up to the cloud. And basically, you can take these and follow the calls that are in them. I'm actually more interested in like transitioning. So I tried taking our reference design template, which is a good place for people to start because it has like a different file that implements each of our services. So you can like get rid of the service if you're not using it, or you can start that and fill in between the blanks. It's
Yeah.
kind of
Fill in the
a
blanks is
nice way
great.
to get
That's a
going.
great
Yeah.
level for me. We've talked about that on YouTube
Yeah.
before.
So I just I actually learned a lot about the beta and the difference when I started doing this. Even though I'd been working with these and testing this as the firmware team was pulling it up, like until the rubber hits the road, you don't see the benefit. And here's just one example, and I'm sure you can't read anything in this. I'll try and make it a little bit bigger, but this is a callback for a setting. So Goliath has a setting service that you can set all your devices in your fleet, or you can target individual devices or whatever, but it just makes it really easy to say, hey, device, here's a setting, and then have confirmation that the device got that setting. Or if it didn't get that setting, or it said there was something wrong, it'll tell you why. And before, on the left side with the Zephyr SDK, I always had to do a lot of things. All I want to do here is change I think I'm changing the delay between sensor readings.
Yeah.
And so like
Update every
the
5
first
seconds,
thing,
right?
yeah, like the first thing that I have to look at is like, is it the wrong type of data? Like, did I get a string when I was expecting an integer? And then now that I have an integer, I have to say, okay, well, is this integer bounded correctly? Like, is it too big or is it too small? And if it is, like, send back an error. And then I actually have to do the updates here. So over on the right with the new SDK, I don't have to do any of that. I really just come in and I get my new loop delay, and I write a message that says I got my new loop delay, and I write success back to Goliath. And the reason for that is there's an additional API call. So before, you had this very simple one line API call, and that style of API call still exists. If you want to do all this stuff and not have any of this hand-holding help, that's fine. But since everyone needs to get integers as settings, there's an int with range, and then you just give it a minimum and a maximum value, and it calls that callback. And it only, I guess I should say, it only calls that callback if it's within that minimum maximum value and it's the right type of data. And if not, it just sends the expected error message back to Goliath. And it's like, everyone has to do this stuff. Why don't we just do this for them? And it feels really good.
Yeah, this is the guardrails you kind of mentioned too, right? This is literally like, because you have mins and max and stuff like that, it's kind of like this writ large to the rest of the SDK as well, right? It's kind of taking these common use cases, making them more common or more less complex for the user to implement in user code, and then spreading that across all of the different functions that we do.
Right. And I also, you can only make so many JSON packets in C before you're like, and then you're like, okay, I'll switch to CBOR.
Curly brackets.
Yeah, CBOR packing can be challenging as well. And the thing is, if you just have one value that you need to update, it doesn't seem like it should have to be that hard. And so this is the Doxygen API reference, and these are all of the APIs to send data to Goliath. And you can see in here, if I just need to like set a bool, either asynchronously or synchronously, there are the two function calls, or a float or a string or an int. And then if you want something more complex, you have JSON, both synchronous and asynchronous. And then you also have CBOR, which is around here somewhere. Trust me, folks, there is CBOR. I don't see it right now. I'd have to search for it.
There it is,
but
at the bottom of the page. You see a CBOR sync.
Aha. Yeah, this is stream. So there's one up here is for stateful versus time series. But the point is the API calls that you see in the samples are only like the tip of the iceberg. And for me, I'm always like working on something and I think, oh, it would be nice if I had a blank. And basically now you do. So like, give this a try. I think you're really going to like it.
And how do people give it a try? So it's in beta. They can get started right now.
Yeah, so you can get started right now. It's live on GitHub, and we invite you to give it a try. Our advice is if you are planning to go to production in 2023, you should probably stick with the Goliath Zephyr SDK because it's in beta, but we'll be moving to general availability in 2024. So if you're planning to do production in 2024, you should start with this right now. If you have feedback on whatever, any of these APIs, how something works under the hood, anything, documentation, just the general smell of the SDK, let us know. beta@goliath.io. We are hungry for your feedback. I've gone around and pestered a bunch of people. You may be watching this and you're one of the people that I pestered, but we pestered a bunch of people to say, hey,
we'd like to apologize for
Mike.
Mike.
Yeah, well, the problem is you can eat your own dog food and you can see how things work, but you kind of get blinded by that. And so we're like, we really
eventually
do want
say,
people to
would you like to try this delicious food?
Delicious. Wonderful. At any rate, I think this is going to make lives a lot easier. I think Goliath was already doing amazing things. This new API, I'm kind of in love with it. And I think that you're going to be in love with it too, as much as you can. I mean, really the goal of this is it shouldn't even like be in your mind. Like it should be so easy that you're able to make this stuff happen and you don't have to spend all day learning things and worrying about it. And I think we made big steps there. We might be able to do better with your feedback. So please help us out.
Yes, that's great. That's great. All right. Well, thanks, Mike, for telling us about this. I'm excited to see everyone's feedback, and we'll have more videos about the firmware SDK. Of course, you'll see that in reference designs all over the Golioth device side code base, which is all open source. And we'd love to hear from you. So please reach out, and we'll see you in the next video.